So my name is Brett Maitland. Unlike everyone else who's spoken before you, I'm not a procurement specialist. Huge disappointment, I'm sure. But virtually all the information you need to know is in your package. Hussein went over it, so I'm not going to walk you through the bulk of the information you already have. What I want to do instead is just land on a couple of points that you will have heard, you'll hear again, but for me they're kind of refresher points, so bear with me. The first, and I'm mindful of my time, so I'm a firm believer in trying to keep to time. The Inter-American Development Bank Group, so I'm going to emphasize the word group because it's a bit like the World Bank Group. It's more than just the bank, more than just the sovereign guaranteed, more than just the public lender side of it. And that's pretty important, and I'll get to that in a second. Slides are pretty self-evident, right? It focuses on the development of its borrowing member countries. So to be frank, it doesn't care about you folks. You're not the purpose of the bank or the bank group. Their borrowing member countries are economic and social development. I don't mean that to be rude or blunt, but just they have no mandate to work with you folks. You're a vehicle to achieve something they want to achieve, economic and social development, borrowing member countries. And for us, the focus is Latin American and Caribbean. I occasionally get questions around, well, what about work in Africa? Not what the Inter-American Bank Group does. Also, it's essentially all of the Caribbean, minus Cuba. We've had a lot of questions about Cuba. There's a lot of excitement about trying to get Cuba on board. Trust me, I think most people in the bank group would love to find a way to get Cuba on board, but that's another discussion, another presentation. And the small island states in the Caribbean, the Inter-American Development Bank Group supports their growth through the Caribbean Development Bank. So just a kind of a quick primer. And as many others have pointed out, they do it through a range of different facilities. Money is the thing that most people tend to land on, but the bank group prides itself on the fact that it pushes out information. And I want to stress that because there are many entities in this room that are interested in contracting opportunities, but there's tremendous opportunity to share the knowledge you have that can be extremely useful for the development of countries. Okay? And it's not an executing agency. As Hussein pointed out, these aren't the folks on the ground that are delivering the projects. They're there to, like your own bank, they're not buying my house, right? They're just providing the money. So, I mentioned before, it's a group. There are three constituent elements to it. The IDB, which I tend to refer to as the bank, just to keep it simple, Inter-American Development Bank, the Inter-American Investment Corporation, and the Multilateral Investment Fund. The bulk of the information you're going to have in your folders and in your procurement documents is focused mostly on the bank and to a certain extent on the corporation, and almost not at all on the MIF. And it's a bit of a bias because the MIF is a fairly small fund. It does present opportunities, but the bulk of the opportunities flow through the bank and hopefully going forward from the corporation. Little asterisk there. As of January the 1st, the bank focuses essentially on providing loans and technical assistance to governments. And that's very broad, of course. It's from national down to subnational, so including, in effect, cities, right? The IIC, the corporation, is focused on the private sector, providing investment loan opportunities for private sector partners. And the Multilateral Investment Fund, it's relatively tiny, but they deal with micro-enterprise, but dealing through a range of organizations. I flag that because fundamentally, these are separately chartered development institutions. They have their own charters, they have their own legal structures, they have their own staff, they have their own decision-making processes, and frequently different policies, and in some ways different procurement systems. Couple of things to bear in mind though, and I think Hussein touched on it. Borrowing member countries basically control these entities. Makes it sound kind of nefarious, it isn't, it's a good thing. Borrowing member countries oftentimes are extremely sensitive to their needs, and let's say they're quite prepared to make difficult decisions. Recently, for instance, in the context of the bank group, they accepted a retroactive increase in their loan charges and additional costs to take out loans to maintain the liquidity of the bank and to keep its AAA rating. That's tough. That's a lot of small countries in Central America basically saying they will pay more for their loans and the impact it has on the purchase of school uniforms, provision of services, etc., they feel it. So these are not irresponsible donors or borrowers, sorry. They're very aware of the impact that the bank has on their development. One other critical point just to flag, and you'll probably hear it in different presentations and points, despite the fact they have different strategies, there are a few things that they have very much in common aside from borrowing member country ownership. A strict commitment to environmental and social safeguards. This is something that cuts across all the loans and activities that the bank group members are involved in. And frequently, frankly, it's an opportunity for contracting opportunities for a lot of Canadian firms. In fact, a lot of the high numbers of contracting opportunities within the bank group are a result of due diligence and other activities undertaken by companies. And we're a member of all three. Canada's a member of all three. I'm not going to bore you with the details and the percentages because really they're irrelevant for you folks. But the bottom line is it means that Canadian entities can take advantage of these organizations to receive, in some cases, loans, but more importantly, to bid on contracts. The difference, for instance, within the IDB group, for instance, the UK is a member. The UK is not a member of the IIC. So technically, UK companies, consultancies, et cetera, would find it very challenging to bid on opportunities. Again, I can go into the details on how much money flows through them. It's a lot, but frankly, well beyond what you're ever going to tap into directly. The IDB is the largest at about $9 billion in annual approvals. That's serious money. The IIC is growing to $2 billion, and the MIF is about $800 million. So it's relatively small, but again, there are opportunities there. Okay, this is my Where's Waldo slide. I recognize that probably nobody in this room can see all the fine print, and I'm doing that a little bit deliberately. Everyone in this room, I'm certain, can find an opportunity to work with the bank. This is just the bank's areas of engagement alone. Unless you're selling nuclear weapons, right? Or I don't know what, tobacco products, right? You're going to find yourself somewhere in this list of sectoral areas, right? It's quite broad and quite vast, and I think Hussein touched on it earlier, as did Michael. The bank group, we focus in this case only on the Americas, but it is committed to the social and economic development of its countries. And of course, over time, that has taken on a whole bunch of different tracks. So again, if I left it up here long enough, I'm sure you could finger walk through and find something. But trust me, everyone in this room, the water is warm, come on in. Right, decision makers. A lot of questions we tend to get is, well, who makes the decisions? Clearly at the top, the Board of Governors. After this meeting, I get to fly to Bahamas for a Board of Governors meeting. That's where the big decisions are taken every year. These agree on things like targets for climate change, the agreement to merge all the private sector operations of the bank group into the IIC at that level. Board of Executive Directors, so in effect, that's where I'm found. I work in Canada's office for the Executive Director, so I help to set policy in my own small way. The President and Executive VP of the, now here I'm focused on the IDB in effect, the bank. It's a fairly similar structure for the corporation, but the President makes a number of fairly important operational decisions. But really, when it comes down to how projects are designed, where decisions happen, it's roughly in that flow that you see there. The Vice President for countries, all the country planning that's done in DC, the country offices, as Hussein pointed out, you got to know these folks. You got to get down to the countries. That's where a lot of the decisions and mapping occur. In the bank, the sectors and knowledge, and that list I showed you, that sort of Where's Waldo list of all the different areas, that's managed in effect out of that group there. That's the area that actually designs projects and interventions. But it's all delivered and sourced through the executing agencies at country level. So hence the importance of connecting at the country level. Last slide. One of the questions we are often asked is, so what makes the IDB different as a group from the World Bank, from the Asian Development Bank, from the African Development Bank? I just trotted out a couple of points. I'm a good IDB flunky, so I'll say all the good things about us. Deep knowledge of Latin American and Caribbean countries. Perhaps that's a given, but I have to stress it. The bank is present in all of its borrowing country members. Frequently, it is the lead donor in Haiti, for instance. In Guyana, where I was, they had one of the biggest, most impressive buildings going. So as a loaner and as a source of information, they're ideally placed in Latin American countries. They have a very strong collaboration connection with the borrowing member countries too. By the way, this isn't made up. This is actually based on surveys that the bank group has done with its clients, and I'd be happy to share that document. As I mentioned, it's present in each of its borrowing member countries, highly regarded for the knowledge it has. So I come back to that point about they don't just push dollars out the door. They're a great source of knowledge, great source of research, and they're respected for that. It is the leading source of development finance for Latin American and Caribbean. Of course, the World Bank Group provides some funding into the region, both through the IBRD and through the IFC. But the IDB Group, that's where the bulk of the funding comes from. And last, borrowing country ownership. This was considered pretty darn significant in its time when the bank was created. And it remains a pretty defining characteristic of the bank group as it stands. I'll stop there because I think at some point we're going to have networking opportunities. So thank you.